Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Thinktank.
A warm welcome to Mena-Watch. My name is Jasmin Arémi, and today we have the pleasure of hosting the queer activist Michaela Dudley. Michaela, you are a queer activist, a cabaret artist, a lawyer, a columnist, and one of the most prominent voices of our current time. You were born in the USA and currently live in Berlin and have for a long time, as you told me. Your spectrum of work spans from essays and columns to political satire, along with serious analysis and media criticism. And besides your Taz column, Woman Without a Menstrual Background, people can also read the new edition of your book, Race Relations, Essays on Racism. And in this book, you present a body of work that shows how deeply discriminatory structures are ingrained in our daily lives and why solidarity alliances, crossing cultural and religious boundaries, are absolutely vital for survival. And today, we want to discuss these intersections of Black identity, Jewish identity, Israel solidarity, and the price one pays for holding clear positions. It's great to have him here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Service, shalom. And yes, I first experienced the world, born right there in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. And that was in the year 1961. And during that very same year, the Berlin Wall was constructed right here. And that's a kind of metaphor that has resonated with me throughout my life, you see, because I'm constantly dealing with that walls, to tear them down. But it's also about building bridges, you know, and one must do both when one, to stand for something meaningful. And for me, this is, it's self-evident that when bridges are built, they should aim to contribute to the strengthening of connections between different communities, are fortified. In other words, they are empowered and made stronger. And in a democratic society, that is truly essential. A democracy that lacks solidarity is basically a kind of fiction.
Then I'd like to start with the first question I have for you. Which everyday experiences have most acutely sharpened your awareness of racism, and what differences do you see between the US and Germany?
Okay, basically you have to put it this way. I have been able to experience these things firsthand for myself. I was able to experience firsthand, and I also came to realize that the fundamental structures of racism are very similar, for example, to the structural underpinnings of anti-Semitism. And it is clear to me to state that there are various types and different manifestations of both racism and anti-Semitism, but they are fundamentally rooted. So both forms of discrimination, as well as queerphobia, as well as misogyny, all forms of discrimination are based on a systematic devaluation, systematic disregard and contempt, and othering, meaning the act of highlighting and emphasizing the differences of other people, those from other groups, and then fundamentally viewing these distinctions as problematic or suspicious. And yes, those are my experiences. They are verbal disputes and arguments, threats of violence, and so on. In the USA, in the 1960s, I experienced the Ku Klux Klan. I saw them live for the very first time through the very, very thin car window as we were driving through the southern states. And Something like that truly leaves a lasting impression, doesn't it? But I perceive commonalities. I see strong similarities, because hate, after all, is hate.
Was there a specific trigger that led you to decide to write this book, Race Relations Essays über Rassismus, which we also have right here?
Yes, I mean, I had already been working as a journalist for years before that and had written on these topics. I had been writing about these very topics for a long time, hadn't I? But after the George Floyd murder, there was, I would say, a significant new surge of interest in this matter. And I came to realize that especially what was being written here in Germany about racism was what was written was not specific enough in its discussion of the issues. It was just a very vague concept of what it actually was. Or people would talk with academic verbose language, or rather with overly academic phrasing, so to speak. They're topics which were not articulated with the appropriate clarity or specificities. So, for example, the authors of the anti-racism works could refer to the Diversity Charter, the anti-racism. Authors could basically rattle off the Diversity Charter on anti-racism from memory. However, to connect all these mosaic pieces and then from that create a true and complete picture that actually addresses the core issues at the root of the problem, that was lacking. The communicative ability in most of the books I have read on the topic wasn't particularly strong. They very passionately only scratched the surface and concerned themselves very little with history. You had people who had hardly even touched on the history of the civil rights movement in the United States. It was as if they themselves had invented anti-racism or similar concepts and were only now intending to proclaim them. To put it differently, I knew I could do it better. I could communicate it more effectively, more provocatively. And yes, I wrote precisely the book that I wish I had been able to read myself, you know. It was something that I had genuinely felt was missing until that point in time, you know.
Exactly. I mean, your book has totally great storytelling. You explain the historical background very clearly, and you also essentially bring people into these scenarios that you've experienced firsthand or that simply unfolded in history. And I definitely found it extremely insightful, and I learned so much from it. You've just re-released it now, haven't you? Why was this new edition an urgent moment for you?
The new edition is set to be published in March of 2025. So the second edition is an expanded one, and it delves deeply into the topic of anti-Semitism, especially in view of the fact of what has happened. Des Antisemitismus, besonders in Anbetracht since October 7th, the rampant anti-Semitism that is widely spreading around, and also in view of the fact that society finds it difficult to deal with this, to acknowledge that anti-Semitism can also come from the left. And in fact does come from the left. For me, it was important that we first acknowledge that fact and then turn our attention to the, for instance, referencing the powerful alliance forged between Black individuals, specifically African Americans, and Jewish communities in the United States. Because Yes, when we talk about that alliance, we are referring to a very strong partnership that has contributed a great deal to the fact that civil rights exist to the extent that we now possess, that we currently have, and that we should truly be enjoying right now.
So, these alliances between Black and Jewish communities during the US civil rights movement. What factors contributed to the profound strength of this connection? And do you also see a possibility to bring any of that forward into the present day, into today's world?
What made them so strong is once again closely related to the similarity of their historical experiences and struggles. In ancient times, so to speak, back in the day, Jewish people were in bondage in Egypt. And then Black people were subjected to the Arab-led trans-Saharan slave trade, and subsequently through the European-led slave trade, were enslaved, were abducted, shipped across the seas, sold into slavery, and ultimately worked to death. And both these groups can say from this experience that they understand firsthand what it is like to be subjected to generations of, to be in servitude to a society's demands. Much of the Jewish experience we can understand from religious biblical narratives and also from the experience of American slaves, specifically Black slaves. When we consider that, we observe that individuals such as Harriet Tubman, for instance, who was referred to as Moses within her underground movement, she was a conductor, an escape helper, and truly a leader, much like Moses in her actions. Moses, who is a significant figure from the Hebrew stories, and this idea of an exodus, yes, the concept of deliverance and emancipation was exceedingly strong and prominent within both groups. And in that respect, that essentially served as a cornerstone, a foundational basis for the realization that when it came to emancipation, people understood that cohesion and furthermore solidarity extending beyond one's own immediate community are of significant importance. During Harriet Tubman's time, there were also white individuals who advocated for abolitionists as authors and so forth, who spoke out and advocated for this cause, who really stood out, who had advocated for the emancipation of slaves. And some of them were Jewish people. This was true even in those times. And it really helped solidify this alliance into a firm structure. And in the book, I mentioned, if I could just summarize it briefly right now, there are so many areas that are tangential to each other here. A Jewish philanthropist in the USA during the 19th century did something quite remarkable. In the early 20th century, they astonishingly financed and established over 2,000 Black elementary schools from the ground up, and also funded the 20 HBCUs, that is, historically Black colleges and universities, which are, of course, Black higher education institutions. Jewish people were very deeply involved in the founding of the civil rights organization, the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It has maintained that distinguished title throughout all the decades. And in the Second World War, in Buchenwald and at the Gunskirchen concentration camp, there were black GIs who were involved in liberating people from those concentration camps, who were involved in the liberation of people from the concentration camps. And for many European Jews, this was their initial interaction that they had ever had with black people, apart from perhaps movies or photographs or something of that sort. And immediately they arrived as liberators. Martin Luther King and Joachim Prinz, a king and a prince, Joachim Prinz from Berlin, a rabbi and Holocaust survivor, and also Joshua Heschel, a rabbi who was also a Holocaust survivor. All of them were deeply influential figures.
Joshua Heschel, Rabbiner, ebenfalls Holocaust-Überlebende.
During the 60s, when I was quite young, they united and marched together, protesting against racism, because both African Americans and members of the Jewish community were tragically being murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan certainly didn't appreciate seeing white people coming to the aid of black people. For instance, to engage them in the civil rights movement, and specifically, Jewish white individuals were particularly targeted, heavily targeted, and also brutally lynched by the Ku Klux Klan. Indeed, they were lynched, killed, and executed. And that connects people, that connects people. And I can recall that from my time in the United States as well, back in my childhood days. For quite some time, Jewish children were, for a certain period, the sole white children who would engage in play and activities with us black children. And these particular children were, the offspring of actual Holocaust survivors. I still remember how I became curious about why not only the men in this specific family, but also the women had tattoos on their arms, and not particularly ornamental or aesthetically pleasing tattoos, mind you. And one day I was given insight into this. Informed about it. That was thematically my very first contact, my initial interaction with the topic of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and also my experiences with these individuals, my fellow humans, helped to explain why my relationship with Jewish people, I am Catholic after all, why I do not want to sacrifice my relationship with them, sacrifice my bond with Jewish people to current trends. I wouldn't even think of it. It's something that I also wanted to impart. I also have another work is currently underway, specifically addressing this topic. However, even in my current book on racism, I explore the connections between black and Jewish communities. This is because it represents an alliance that extends its benefits beyond just these two groups, also promoting greater solidarity and human rights for all. Is an alliance that advocates for cohesion and human rights, and from this, all people, all humanity ultimately benefit. Now that you're explaining it like that, it's definitely noticeable that you hear nothing about this in the current debate. I mean, in Germany, it's more the case that leftists would just shrug their shoulders at the topic. Do you think that's ignorance, or is it a conscious rejection because it doesn't fit into their own worldview? Yes, and yes, and yes. Ignorance. Yes, and also indifference, and let's not forget ideology. You do hear about it. You hear it from me. At the Taz, I have a few articles on that topic, specifically focusing on the relationship between Black people and Jewish individuals, and particularly on the subject of Black communities in Palestine, as there are many white, left-leaning white individuals who, white saviors who actually don't want to describe it, to expound upon these very strong connections between Black people and Jewish individuals. You also touched upon that particular point. I speak about it, and because of that, I even get tentatively cancelled for it. I speak out about it emphatically, and for instance, at an event held right here within the framework of a specific, the University of the Arts located in Berlin. Before this event, there were some protests from a certain group, I'd say euphemistically, from some critics of Israel, you know, and I mean that in the strongest possible terms. And some of those individuals were rather fond of showcasing red triangles on their social media profiles. Wouldn't you agree? That's a pretty clear statement indeed. These individuals specifically wished that I would not delve into the historical context of the alliance that formed between African Americans and Jewish communities within the United States. They didn't want me to even speak about it here in Berlin, you know, at all.
How do you account for that? I mean, typically they always assert that Israel is racist, so we're supposedly fighting racism since we're against Israel. That's an argument frequently put forward nowadays. But how can you possibly rationalize the alliance, for example, between left-wing queer individuals and Hamas?
Stupidity and hate. Stupidity and hate. When I speak about the alliance, I inevitably, and indeed very willingly, also address the tragic, approximately 1,500-year-long history of the trans-Saharan slave trade. The trans-Saharan slave trade is also referred to as slave trade referred to by Arabs. It's estimated that during that period, an estimated 20 million plus Africans were enslaved, and that occurred long before the onset of the equally dreadful and cruel transatlantic slave trade perpetrated by the Europeans. The Arab slave trade persisted for approximately 14 to 1500 years. That means it lasted for a whole millennium. Longer. And for an entire millennium, which is significantly longer than the roughly 400 years of the European slave trade. And yet, there are still people within certain pro-Palestinian circles who assert that this wasn't an act of racism, but rather simply a consequence of the prevailing laws of war at that time under which these enslaved individuals were taken, who were enslaved for 14 to 1500 years, purely coincidentally from Africa, correct? And then systematically castrated. The men, even within the United States, where slaves were also systematically castrated, the men, even in the USA, where slaves were also castrated. It did happen, but more as a punishment and not systematically. All this brutality and so forth. And the pro-Palestinian folks don't really want to talk about it because they wanted to spread a narrative of solidarity between Black people and those associated with the Intifada. And indeed, it simply does not fit into the established narrative to talk about this brutal racism that was prevalent under the then dominant Islamic powers, and so on and so forth. Islamic imperialism is a deeply sensitive topic, a red rag to a bull, yes, something forbidden. In the pro-Palestinian community, this topic is not openly discussed, and if it is, then it is justified in a similar manner to how racists attempt to justify the slave trade, the European slave trade. Oh, it wasn't racist at all. Instead, it was due to economic necessity, or perhaps the enslaved people weren't treated all that badly, and so on and so forth. And with all these projections and so on and so forth, it was argued that the enslaved individuals actually fared better as a result of their enslavement. The pro-Palestinian, the Free Palestine community is not genuinely concerned with, nor are they truly striving for freedom. Indeed, the Intifada liberated absolutely no one, and that most certainly includes black people. And there's a certain irony to the fact that, and whoever reads my book reads it, they will also be able to perceive it. But here's a spoiler, a mini spoiler. In the USA, for example, it's been since the 19th century. The watermelon slice, or indeed any watermelon at all, has been regarded as a racist symbol when linked to black people. This perception stemmed from the prevailing sentiment at that time. Yes, there was a particular prejudice or stereotype asserting that black individuals, especially following the abolition of slavery, after its conclusion, black individuals were thought to simply lounge around consuming watermelon. So, isn't it a bit ironic that here in Berlin you have some black people who are happy to march along in the wake of this Free Palestine movement, you know, joining in, and at the same time use the watermelon slice as their symbol? Isn't that, you know, a bit of real-life satire at its finest? Joshua Morel, a black man from Tanzania, in Israel, was among the very first victims of Hamas on October 7th, was among the first victims. His face went viral. This is this young black man in his early 20s who was on camera by Hamas, racially trolled, and then shortly thereafter he was lynched to death. His countryman too, Felix Clemens Matenge. Matenge suffered a similar fate as well. You know, he was murdered by Hamas. The fact that these two young men were black, well, it meant absolutely nothing, or rather nothing positive when it came to Hamas. Hamas had absolutely no qualms whatsoever about murdering these people. They didn't consider them kindred spirits in their fight against the evil white people or anything of that sort. Hamas murdered these two black men. They weren't even Jewish, nor were they Israeli. They were simply murdered, first harassed, and then killed. But who would truly be surprised by that? Among the hundreds of victims at the rave festival, there were most certainly included numerous peaceful opponents of the Netanyahu government. Also people who had worked for peace had committed themselves to Gaza and Israel, people living in Gaza who had provided aid, etc., etc. They were simply massacred, raped, mutilated, and in an utterly grotesque fashion in any arbitrary sequence, just for the sake of it, in any order. And well, that merely serves to demonstrate to me that one can have absolutely nothing whatsoever in common with terrorists. And it's not a liberation movement, but a terrorist organization aiming for mass murder. It is a group comprised of mass murderers, gang rapists, gangsters, abductors. This group should not be legitimized in any way, and certainly not by the participation of black activists who would falsely claim that these individuals are the true colonialists. If one truly desires to understand more about colonialism in the Middle East, one should not focus on Israel, but instead on Islamic imperialism.
I believe we don't need to discuss how incredibly presumptuous and frankly somewhat insane it is to refer to Hamas or Hezbollah as liberation movements. You describe in your book.
Go tell that to many of my current and former colleagues in the media. Seriously, tell them that. No, really, tell them that there are individuals out there seriously attempting, and perhaps we can briefly touch upon my article at Mena-Watch, who are genuinely endeavoring to draw a false moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel, who are earnestly trying to justify the Intifada movement. There are individuals in the media who earnestly try to present the Intifada movement as a liberation movement. You know, that's what they do. Actually, we should be discussing that more frequently and exposing it for what it is. And that is precisely what I do, and that is why I am also subjected to cancel culture from so-called, indeed, what one might term left liberal newspapers, progressive publications, etc., who profoundly disagree with this, and that is precisely their position. And even in the so-called mainstream media, there's genuinely this idea prevailing that Hamas should be treated on par with Israel. And that is utterly illogical. Israel is a democracy, a truly multicultural, pluralistic democracy. It may not be perfect, but a nation doesn't have to be flawless to be able to defend itself against something that clearly has no intention whatsoever of bringing forth a true democracy. What does the Intifada stand for? I mean, who is the LGBTQ representative for Hamas? So, what women's rights were actually brought about by the Intifada over the course of, over decades? The Intifada stands for murder, death, and indeed fanaticism. And many of my colleagues in the press actually fail to grasp that Hamas doesn't even want to win this war against Israel. Hamas doesn't aim to win this conflict. Rather, it merely seeks to prolong it indefinitely.
In your book, you also describe Israel as a project of self-determination. And what significance does solidarity with Israel hold for you, particularly in light of the escalating and currently rampant anti-Semitism against Jewish individuals globally, which we unfortunately now have to acknowledge?
Yes, it's global, absolutely global. It's no longer just about Israel and Israelis, you see. Who would have thought? My solidarity with Israel is not aligned with any particular political party within the country. It is solidarity with the Jewish state, a state that is, in its very essence, pluralistic and multicultural. As a queer feminist, I truly emphasize certain aspects. Don't you agree? I am stressing points that are very difficult for the Free Palestine movement to stomach. As I said, the question I ask is, who is the LGBTQ representative for Hamas? These people from Queers for Palestine, because of that, they are at a complete loss for words, with nothing to articulate except genocide, genocide, genocide. But let me put it to you this way. In Israel, a lesbian of Arab descent has the right to serve as a deputy in the Knesset, which is Israel's parliament. In which of Israel's neighboring countries, for instance, would a lesbian Jewish person even possess the fundamental right to simply exist, let alone hold a position and actively contribute as a parliamentarian? Should I, or queer people?
The spoiler alert in none of them.
Right. Queer individuals, queer partners, couples. In Israel, homosexual couples have been granted the right to marry and adopt since December 2023. Just a few weeks after October 7th, merely a couple of months following the events of October 7th, the Supreme Court in Israel has ruled that homosexual couples are permitted to adopt children. In which of Israel's neighboring countries would that be possible? Would that be possible in Gaza under Hamas? No. Since 2018, I have been working voluntarily to support individual queer refugees. And over the years, that has included a number of individuals from Palestine, you know. And those are, or rather some of them are of Palestinian descent. Some are of Palestinian origin, so to speak. And some of them are from Gaza, including 2 Black individuals from Gaza who identify as queer. I discuss one of these experiences in the book. And the experiences that these people went through there, particularly those from Gaza who lived under Hamas, in terms of the sheer brutality of what these queer individuals endured and barely survived. It's horrifying, isn't it? Many of them actually wanted to go to Israel because they had heard about Tel Aviv, about its queer community in Tel Aviv, and that was actually their goal. They don't perceive Israel and Israelis as adversaries or anything of that sort. I wouldn't assert that everyone is necessarily a follower of the party or an admirer of it, however. In Israelis as not their enemies. Well, these queer individuals whom I have been involved with, and in some cases still am involved with, also tend to call me up at night. Because for them, it's also a bit of a culture shock that they somewhat anticipated that in Europe they wouldn't exactly be welcomed by right-wing extremists, by neo-Nazis, or by ultra-conservatives, right? Wrong skin color, and usually the wrong religion, though some Palestinians are also Christians, the wrong sexuality, and so forth. But the one thing they did not anticipate, is what's truly affecting them deeply. It's the fact that they are being ignored or even demonized more by left-leaning people, by those who identify as progressive. And in my work, which is strictly voluntary, and I haven't done it all by myself, I've noticed, firstly, that these people from Queers for Palestine, where are they? They do not offer assistance in this. They remain very ignorant concerning Gaza. They can't even name 5 cities in Gaza off the top of their heads, yet they protest quite loudly against Israel. Wouldn't you agree? In any case, these individuals protesting against Israel, claiming to be queers for Gaza, have had virtually no interactions or experiences with the genuine queer people who escaped from Palestine, and they haven't shown any desire to do so either. The Free Palestine movement accuses me, as they put it, of doing pinkwashing for Bibi simply because I care for queer refugees from Palestine. That just doesn't fit the narrative, because at its core, it confirms that these individuals, for instance, were subjected to brutal treatment, to be precise, under the rule of Hamas. And that right there is the irony. What am I really saying, calling it irony? It is the hypocrisy of this particular movement that has absolutely no interest in liberty, let alone any sort of peace. And to me, solidarity with Israel is to stand in solidarity with the only democracy, to stand by the side of that democracy in the region, correct? So, by definition, it also means to stand in solidarity with Jewish people. One of my hashtags states, to save Israel is to safeguard humanity as a whole, and I stand by that wholeheartedly. Therefore, I also support the Israeli Defense Forces operation in Gaza. I also absolutely wish that the fewest possible innocent non-combatants are injured or killed as a result of this. I genuinely want that to happen. I know people from that region. Some of the individuals I've provided care for still have relatives residing there, and I wouldn't gain anything from that. I wouldn't feel any sense of joy or anything of that nature from the knowledge that innocent lives are being lost. However, it is an unfortunate reality of warfare that non-combatants, regrettably, also become entangled in the midst of conflict and suffer its consequences. I am aware of this from my own military experience and, broadly speaking, from both a journalistic and legal standpoint. We have to differentiate between what is accidental and what is intentional. And when you are in an asymmetric warfare scenario, particularly in an urban, that is to say, a city environment where the enemy also uses the civilian population as human shields, then it's clear that the outcome would not be particularly pleasant or even agreeable. But to lay the blame on Israel for that is absurd. It is utterly illogical. It is also a non sequitur under international law.
What other experiences have you had with your Israel solidarity in the Black and migrant community in Germany, apart from what you've already mentioned?
Yes, I was at an event, by the way, where Michelle Friedman was also present, and we really understood each other quite well. Well, very well. That was the first time I'd actually encountered something like that. I had also met him in Frankfurt. I was actually one of the 75 honored storytellers, you know. This was for the 75th anniversary of the Frankfurt Book Fair, a truly special occasion. That happened just a few days after October 7th, and I had seen him there, and then later on at an event here in Berlin. At that specific event, which took place in Berlin, there were about 95% BPOC people in the audience, Black and other individuals, people of color, and to my pleasant surprise, my appeals, my exclamations, my urgent calls, and my demands for demonstrating Israel's solidarity with the Jewish community were greeted with enthusiastic applause. And I also performed I have a song called Diversity Rap that I also performed, and in that song I say, for example, you march against fascists because they are so extreme. But tell me, why is there not even a single word against hatred towards Jews? And it was incredibly well received. There was criticism received prior to the event stemming from people's assertions that they would decline to attend if I were scheduled to perform there. Nevertheless, it was a completely sold-out event and was met with a relatively good reception. Overall, since October 7th, I must admit there has been a noticeable shift in perspective, perhaps an expanded awareness. During the initial weeks and months, after October 7th, I must say, I was genuinely very disappointed in the Black community, really disappointed. There were hardly any public acknowledgements or expressions of solidarity with Israel. And then I realized that in numerous instances it was simply because individuals were fearful of publicly acknowledging their solidarity with Israel. I also penned articles on the subject for the Tazi and another publication. Additionally, I conducted interviews with clear names with various other Black individuals residing here in Berlin, and they also expressed their views on the matter, and they were, they were very explicit in stating their rejection of both anti-Semitism and any animosity towards Israel. And there are other individuals within the Black community who share similar perspectives, but they are unable to express them publicly, knowing they would face cancellation. And this is related to the concept of intersectionality. It is a concept, one I also explain in my book, that is called intersectionality. That refers to the versatility of discrimination. For example, to say, all right, this society, women face disadvantages, but white women are in a more favorable position compared to Black women, and the pattern continues. So even Black people here, those who are firmly established in their lives, have an opinion that doesn't align with the Intifada, and they can't express it. But they've also had the experience that if they deviate from the narrative that is put into their mouths by white saviors, by leftist white saviors, that if they deviate from it, they are criticized and cancelled much more harshly. Than white individuals. And this is related to that. Despite everything, I remained quite upset because Black Lives Matter had regarded the terrorist attack as an act of liberation, and what transpired next was even made fun of it to some extent. And what happened, I also addressed this in my book. At that point, I was really fed up with Black Lives Matter and quite disappointed with the situation. But that was a very telling picture, because many Black individuals, especially older Black people like me, know about the extensive experience, the enduring alliance between Black and Jewish people, and how we have consistently supported each other. We are not prepared to sacrifice such a bond for an ideology that sacrifices its own children. I've not only engaged in online discussions, but I've also actively participated in them. I just passively followed along, and then I realized the angry Black woman was indeed present. Many angry Black women voiced their rejection of the Intifada and the Free Palestine movement. This position stems partly from historical reasons, particularly concerning the legacy of slavery, and also because, in stark contrast to the slavery inflicted by Europeans, there was hardly that no reappraisal is taking place, right, for one thing, and for another, because they simply fail to understand why they should indeed, as one person expressed, bringing suicide bombers into the world, and this continues on and on. That's a very pointed way to phrase it, but it does bring it to a head. Black people are attempting to gain a foothold, and who are not necessarily eager to sacrifice themselves, but for an ideology that openly shows children in suicide vests and so on, like Hamas does, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that just does not sit well at all with a lot of Black mothers. Then again, the progressive press, however, has expressed very little interest in emphasizing these discrepancies, and it just completely abandons the trajectory of education and enlightenment. Then the press, its educational mandate, and so on and so forth, aligns with a partisan-motivated criticism against Israel, and consequently fails to facilitate the emergence of alleviating facts and mitigating circumstances. That could speak in Israel's favor to come to the surface and be recognized.
Du hast ja eingangs kurz erwähnt, dass Diskriminierungserfahrungen jüdischer und schwarzer Menschen, also Rassismus und Antisemitismus, auch oft gegeneinander ausgespielt werden.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Thinktank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.